I never minded the night shift at Blackwood Tower. The pay was better, the building was quiet, and I could catch up on my podcast while making my security rounds. The soft hum of the building's systems and the occasional ping of the elevators were my only companions. I'd been working here for 3 months when things started to change. Subtly at first, like the way the air felt heavier after midnight. The elevator would sometimes arrive without me pressing the call button, its doors sliding open with an invitation to step inside. Management had recently renovated the main elevator after some accident they refused to discuss with the staff. All I knew was that someone had died in there, and the company had hushed it up with settlements and NDAs. Tonight marked my 4th night shift this week, and as I approached the bank of elevators, I noticed one was already waiting, doors open as if expecting me. I stepped into the waiting elevator, dismissing my unease as simple late-night paranoia. The doors closed behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop, and I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The elevator began its ascent, the digital display tracking our progress. 1, 2, 3. Then it happened. The lights flickered and the temperature plummeted so drastically I could see my breath. The display suddenly read 13, even though Blackwood Tower didn't have a 13th floor. It skipped from 12 to 14, a common superstition in high-rises. I jabbed at the emergency button, but nothing happened, not even the expected alarm. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering coming from the corners of the elevator, too quiet to understand but unmistakably human. The elevator jerked to a stop, the doors remaining firmly closed as the whispering grew louder. I backed against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest as a handprint appeared in the condensation forming on the mirrored wall opposite me. The print was small, like a child's, and it dragged downward, leaving 5 perfect streaks before disappearing. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened in the elevator. I called in sick the next day and spent hours researching Blackwood Tower's history. The building was only 15 years old, but it had been built on the site of an old hotel that had burned down in the 1970s. Newspaper archives mentioned a tragic accident where a young girl had fallen down an elevator shaft during the chaos of the fire. Her name was Lily Morgan, just 8 years old, visiting with her parents who also perished. I dug deeper and found maintenance reports from Blackwood Tower. 3 engineers had quit in the past year, all citing unusual electrical issues with the main elevator system. One report detailed a malfunction where the elevator had taken a passenger to a non-existent floor. My blood ran cold when I read that the display had shown 13. I printed everything I found and decided I needed to learn more, but to do that I'd have to return to the night shift. I had to face the elevator again. I wasn't going back unprepared. I bought a small digital thermometer, an EMF meter from a paranormal supply website, and a voice recorder. If something was happening in that elevator, I wanted evidence. My girlfriend thought I was losing my mind when I told her about my plans. Just quit, she insisted over dinner, plenty of other security jobs out there. But I couldn't explain why I needed answers, how the cold terror I'd felt had somehow morphed into morbid curiosity. That night before my shift, I laid out my equipment on the kitchen table, checking batteries and functions with methodical precision. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, "Don't go back." I stared at it, wondering who could have sent it, when another came through, "She's waiting for you." I dropped my phone as if it had burned me, and when I picked it up again both messages were gone. Back at Blackwood Tower, I nodded to the day shift guard as he handed over the keys. "Elevators have been acting up," he mentioned casually. "Engineering's coming tomorrow." My heart raced as I settled into the security desk, watching the elevator bank through the monitor. 4 hours, nothing unusual happened. People left for the day, the cleaning crew came and went. At exactly midnight, the main elevator pinged, its doors opening to an empty car. On the security feed, I watched as the elevator began moving between floors with no one inside. 12, 14, 20, 32, 42, back to 1. The pattern repeated 3 times before stopping at the lobby, doors open, waiting. My equipment bag felt heavy as I approached, the EMF meter already buzzing in my pocket. "Lily?" I whispered as I stepped inside. "Are you here?" The doors closed silently behind me. The elevator didn't move, but the temperature dropped dramatically. My thermometer showed a 20-degree plunge in seconds. My voice recorder hissed with static as I held it out before me like a shield. "My name is Daniel. I know about what happened to you, Lily." The overhead lights flickered, and in their momentary darkness, I heard a child's giggle echo through the small space. When the light stabilized, the buttons for floors 1, 3, 7, and 0 were illuminated, but Blackwood Tower didn't have a floor 0. "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked, noting the numbers. 1-3-7-0. The display panel suddenly lit up with all its digits, flickering rapidly until settling on the number sequence 1-9-7-3, the year of the hotel fire. The elevator lurched upward with such speed that my knees buckled, and I crashed to the floor as we passed floor after floor without slowing. I closed my eyes, certain the elevator would crash through the roof, when it abruptly stopped and the doors opened to reveal not a hallway, but what looked like the charred remnants of a hotel corridor. I stepped out into what should have been the 42nd floor of Blackwood Tower but instead found myself in a smoke-damaged hallway with peeling wallpaper and carpet squelching with water beneath my feet. The air smelled of ash and something chemical, fire retardant perhaps, though it had clearly failed in its purpose. A flickering emergency light cast long shadows down the corridor, illuminating room numbers 1307, 1309, 1311. I was on the 13th floor of the old hotel, somehow preserved in this impossible space. My voice recorder continued to run as I moved cautiously down the hall, the crackling static growing louder as I approached room 1370. The door was partially open, revealing a child's suitcase on the bed and toys scattered across the floor as if their owner had left in a hurry. A singed teddy bear sat in a small chair by the window, its button eyes reflecting the dim light as I entered the room. "Lily?" I called softly, "is this your room?" A small voice behind me whispered, "They left me here." I turned slowly, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, but saw nothing but shadows. When the alarms went off, Daddy went to find help and Mommy told me to stay put. The voice continued, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. But the smoke came and I got scared. I tried to use the elevator to go downstairs. My recorder was going wild with static now, the EMF meter's lights all blazing red. But the elevator... The voice faltered, filled with confusion and terror that spanned decades. The elevator didn't stop. It kept going down, past the lobby, past the basement. A cold hand slipped into mine, tiny fingers gripping with surprising strength. "There's something wrong with the elevator shafts here. They go too deep." I looked down and for just a moment saw her, a small girl in a nightgown, her edges blurred like a faded photograph. They built a new building but the deep places are still the same. And I'm not alone down there anymore. "What do you mean you're not alone?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hammering of my heart. The ghostly impression of Lily flickered like a bad transmission. "The man in the black coat," she whispered, her voice dropping further. "He was already down there when I fell. He's been there for so long, since before the hotel." The room around us began to fade, the walls becoming transparent, revealing the modern steel and concrete structure of Blackwood Tower superimposed over the hotel skeleton. "He uses the elevators to climb up," Lily continued, her grip on my hand tightening painfully. "He collects people who ride alone at night, takes them back down with him." The floor beneath us groaned and shifted, and I could feel it beginning to tilt. "He wants you now. He made me bring you here." Lily's form flickered more violently, her face contorting with guilt. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to, but he makes us help him. All of us." The floor gave way beneath my feet, and I was falling through darkness, Lily's hand still clutched in mine. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever, yet no impact came. I opened my eyes to find myself back in the elevator, alone, the display showing we were descending rapidly, 12, 11, 10. But the numbers continued well past the lobby and basement levels. -1, -2, -3. I hadn't known the building had sub-basements this deep. My equipment was going haywire, the recorder emitting a high-pitched squeal, the EMF meter's display cracked but still showing readings off the charts. The walls of the elevator seemed to stretch and warp around me, the metal panels becoming rough-hewn stone glistening with moisture. "Please," I begged to the empty air, "Lily, help me." As if in response, the elevator jolted to a stop at -13, the doors sliding open to reveal absolute darkness beyond. The only illumination came from the elevator itself, casting a pale rectangle of light that disappeared a few feet into the void. From somewhere in that darkness came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching, heavy boots on stone. A tall silhouette appeared at the edge of the light, topped with what looked like an old-fashioned hat, its face obscured by shadow despite the direct light. "Welcome down, Daniel," the figure said, its voice like gravel being crushed. It knew my name. It stepped partially into the light, revealing an outfit that belonged to another century. A long black coat reaching almost to the floor, a high collar and gloves covering long, thin fingers. Where its face should have been was only shadow, deeper than the surrounding darkness, as if light itself was being consumed. "Lily has served me well bringing you here," it continued, remaining carefully positioned so that its face stayed hidden. She's brought many over the years, but few as receptive as you. Behind the figure, I could now make out other shapes moving in the darkness, shadowy forms of different sizes, some clearly children, others adults, all moving with the same unnatural, gliding motion. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, pressing myself against the back wall of the elevator. The figure tilted its head, the movement unnaturally fluid. "What?" "I need a new operator for my elevators. Someone to bring more down. Lily has served her term." It extended a gloved hand toward me. "It's your turn now." I lunged for the control panel, desperately hitting buttons as the figure moved toward me with that same deliberate pace. The doors began to close, agonizingly slowly as the man in black reached the threshold. His gloved hand shot between the closing doors, stopping them effortlessly. "There is no escape through my elevators," he said, pushing the doors back open with unnatural strength. I backed against the rear wall, searching frantically for any weapon or tool. The elevator's emergency hatch in the ceiling caught my eye, my only chance. I jumped, pushing up on the panel as the figure fully entered the elevator. The hatch gave way and I pulled myself up onto the elevator's roof, finding myself in a shaft that seemed impossibly vast, stretching up and down farther than I could see, disappearing into darkness in both directions. Ancient service ladders ran along the walls, rusted but intact. I grabbed the nearest one and began to climb upward as fast as I could, the metal rungs ice-cold beneath my fingers. Below me, the man in black emerged through the hatch with fluid grace, beginning to climb after me with methodical determination. My lungs burned as I climbed, the ladder seeming endless in the dim emergency lighting of the shaft. Below me, the man in black maintained a steady pace, neither gaining nor falling behind, as if he had all the time in the world. The walls of the shaft changed as I ascended, from ancient stone to brick to modern concrete, marking the layers of construction history. Beside me, other elevator cars occasionally passed, filled with ghostly passengers staring straight ahead, unaware of the nightmare realm they were passing through. On one of the landings, I spotted a maintenance door and desperately changed course toward it. My fingers had gone numb from the cold metal, and I nearly slipped several times before reaching the door and yanking it open. I tumbled through into what appeared to be a modern utility corridor of Blackwood Tower, slamming the door behind me and looking for something to barricade it. As I dragged a heavy toolbox against the door, I heard children's laughter echoing from both ends of the corridor. "You can't leave this way," Lily's voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere. "No one ever leaves." I was excited about my new job at the prestigious Meridian Towers, a luxury apartment complex in the heart of downtown. As the new maintenance supervisor, I'd be responsible for ensuring everything ran smoothly in the building's sophisticated systems. The previous supervisor had left suddenly, health reasons they told me, but the impressive salary and benefits package made any concerns I might have had vanish quickly. During orientation, Ms. Keller from management took me through the building's various systems, finishing with what she called the crown jewel, a bank of 3 state-of-the-art elevators with touchscreen panels and voice-activated controls. "The residents love them," she said, though I noticed she only pressed the button for the middle elevator. "This one had some issues last month, but it's been serviced," she added almost as an afterthought. As we rode up, I counted the buttons on the panel, 12 floors, but I could have sworn there was a faint outline where a 13th button should have been. My first week went smoothly, fixing leaky faucets, adjusting thermostats, and familiarizing myself with the building's layout. I was on good terms with most of the residents, who seemed pleased with my prompt responses to their maintenance requests. It wasn't until Friday evening that I encountered anything unusual. I was heading down from the 12th floor after fixing a ceiling fan when the elevator stopped abruptly between floors. The lights flickered, and the digital display flashed 13 momentarily before going dark. A cold draft whistled through the car, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warm September evening. The panel went dark for several seconds before rebooting itself, and the elevator resumed its descent as if nothing had happened. When I mentioned the incident to the night doorman, Eddie, his expression darkened. "Which elevator was it?" he asked, and when I told him it was the middle one, he nodded grimly. "That one's got problems, boss. Been that way since what happened last winter." "What happened last winter?" I asked Eddie, who glanced around the lobby before leaning closer. "You didn't hear this from me," he warned, "but a resident disappeared last December, young woman from 12B, Eliza Chambers." Eddie explained that she had been seen entering the middle elevator late one night, but security cameras showed it never arrived at the lobby. The elevator was found stuck between the 12th floor and what would have been the 13th, if this building had one. The search found nothing and eventually the case went cold. Management replaced the elevator's control system and claimed it was a camera malfunction, that she must have exited on another floor. But her key fob never registered anywhere else in the building, Eddie whispered. And there'd been noises since then. Like someone crying inside the shaft when the car isn't there. I tried dismissing the story as building gossip, but that night I dreamed of being trapped in an elevator with the buttons melting under my fingers, a woman's voice whispering from the ceiling, "Help me find the 13th floor." Curiosity got the better of me the next day. I searched online for information about Eliza Chambers and found several news articles about her disappearance. She had been a 28-year-old investment banker, described by friends as ambitious and level-headed. The articles mentioned the police investigation had focused on the building's security systems, particularly the elevator anomaly. I also discovered that Meridian Towers had been built on the site of an old hotel that had indeed possessed 13 floors before being demolished in the early 2000s. The architect's original plans for Meridian included a 13th floor, but it was later removed from the designs due to superstition, or so the official story went. That afternoon I examined the elevator's maintenance logs and found numerous entries from my predecessor about phantom power draws and system resets, occurring specifically at 1:13 a.m. The most recent entry, dated just one day before he quit, read only, "It's trying to rebuild the 13th floor. God help us all." I decided to stay late that night to witness the 1:13 a.m. phenomenon for myself. I set up in the security room with access to the camera feeds and the building's power monitoring systems. Eddie brought me coffee before ending his shift at midnight, giving me a concerned look before leaving. "Be careful, boss," was all he said. The building settled into nighttime quiet, with only the occasional resident returning home from a late evening out. At 1:10 a.m. I noticed the first sign, a power surge in the middle elevator systems, though it wasn't in operation. At exactly 1:13 the elevator activated itself, the car rising from the lobby with no passengers inside. On the monitor, I watched as it ascended past the 12th floor and then stopped, hovering in a space where no floor existed. The power usage spiked dramatically, enough to trigger backup systems, and the camera feed from inside the elevator filled with static. Through the interference I could just make out what looked like construction. The walls of the elevator seemed to be extending, forming a hallway where none should exist. I rushed from the security room to the 12th floor, arriving just as the elevator returned to normal operation. The digital display above the doors briefly showed 13 before changing to 12. My heart pounding, I pressed the call button, and the doors opened immediately. The elevator appeared normal, but the temperature inside was noticeably colder than the hallway. Something compelled me to enter, though every instinct screamed against it. Once inside, I noticed something odd about the control panel, a smudge where the 13th button would be if it existed. I rubbed it with my thumb and to my shock the smudge gave way to reveal a hidden button, unlabeled but definitely real. My hand trembled as I reached out to press it, a voice in my head warning me not to, but my curiosity was overwhelming. The moment my finger touched the button, the lights in the elevator died completely. In the darkness, I felt the car begin to rise, despite the display remaining unlit. A woman's voice whispered from somewhere above me, "Finally, someone who can see." When the doors opened, I found myself looking not at another apartment hallway, but at what appeared to be an active construction site, half-finished walls, exposed wiring and plastic sheeting hanging from temporary frameworks. The space had a translucent quality as if not quite solid, with the familiar 12th floor hallway faintly visible through it like a double exposure. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the impossible space. I stepped out cautiously, the floor solid beneath my feet despite its unfinished appearance. Construction lights cast long shadows across the area, though I could see no power source for them. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, a woman in business attire, her back to me. "Eliza," I ventured, and she turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was beautiful but hollow-eyed, her skin pale as paper. "You pressed the button," she said, her voice resonating from everywhere rather than just her mouth. "Now you can help me finish it." "Finish what?" I asked, taking a cautious step toward her. Eliza's form flickered like a bad television signal as she gestured to the unfinished space around us. "They tried to erase it, but buildings have memories," she explained. "The 13th floor is trying to reassert itself. It just needs materials." A chill ran through me as I began to understand. "What kind of materials?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Eliza smiled, her teeth too white, too perfect. The architect used forbidden principles when designing the original hotel, she explained. Spaces that exist between worlds require sacrifices to maintain them. She pointed to the walls, and I noticed with horror that the support beams seemed to be made of something organic, pulsing slightly in the dim light. The hotel collected souls for decades. When they tore it down, they thought they could erase what was done here. But the 13th floor never left, it just went dormant, waiting. She stepped closer, her movements more fluid now, more real. It needs a new caretaker. Someone with the skills to maintain complicated systems. You want me to be what, some kind of supernatural maintenance man? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my terror. Eliza laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. That's exactly what's needed. Someone to maintain the barrier between worlds. This floor exists in both, and in neither. She explained that the 13th floor had been designed as a gateway, using principles of sacred geometry and what she called architectural sorcery. The original hotel's architect had created it as a space where the veil between worlds was thin. I discovered it by accident, she continued, her form becoming more solid with each passing moment. I pressed the hidden button late one night and found this, but I wasn't prepared to become its caretaker. You are. She reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching my face. The building chose you. That's why the last supervisor left, he couldn't hear it calling. You can. I backed away, bumping into one of the half-finished walls. And if I refuse? Eliza's expression hardened, her eyes growing darker. Then the barrier continues to weaken. And what's on the other side gets through. Suddenly, the floor beneath us trembled, and a low moan seemed to emanate from the very structure of the building. It's happening already, Eliza said urgently. Look. She pointed to where the unfinished hallway ended in empty space, except it wasn't empty anymore. A swirling darkness had formed, like a tear in reality itself. Through it, I glimpsed shapes moving, writhing forms that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The 13th floor was never meant to be removed from the building's plans, Eliza explained. It was a containment system designed to keep these entities at bay. When they demolished the hotel, they thought they were just tearing down a building. They didn't understand they were dismantling a prison. The tear widened slightly, and a tendril of darkness reached through, probing the air before retreating. Every time the elevator activates at 113, the barrier weakens further. Soon it will fail completely. She fixed me with an intense stare. Unless someone maintains it properly. Unless you accept the role you were brought here to fill. I stared at the widening tear in reality, my mind racing through the implications. Part of me wanted to run back to the elevator, escape this nightmare, and never return. But another part, the problem solver, the maintenance man, was already assessing the situation, seeing the building as a system that needed repair. What exactly would I need to do? I asked, still not committing but wanting to understand. Eliza's expression softened with what looked like relief. Restore the 13th floor fully. Strengthen the barriers. Guide lost souls back to their proper place. She gestured to a blueprint that had materialized on a nearby workbench, showing the original architectural plans for the 13th floor, complex geometric patterns forming what looked like a massive sigil when viewed from above. And yes, there would be a price, she added, anticipating my next question. You would be bound to this place, able to leave the building only for short periods. Your lifespan would be linked to the structure itself. The tear pulsed again, wider this time, and a cold wind carrying whispers in no human language blew through the unfinished hallway. There isn't much time to decide, Eliza urged, her form beginning to fade as the elevator behind me dinged softly. I'll do it, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I fully realized I'd decided. Something about this felt right, as if I'd been preparing for this role my entire life without knowing it. Eliza smiled, a genuine expression of gratitude that transformed her face. Then we begin now. She led me to the blueprints and began explaining the principles behind the floor's design. Ley lines that ran beneath the building, numerical sequences embedded in the layout, and materials that would strengthen the barrier. You'll need to collect certain items, she instructed. Metals from specific sources, woods from trees that grew on sacred ground. For the next several hours, which felt like days, she taught me the fundamentals of what she called architectural binding, techniques that blended engineering, sacred geometry, and something older than either. Occasionally, the tear would pulse and grow, and Eliza would show me how to reinforce the barrier temporarily using visualization techniques and precise movements of my hands, as if weaving invisible threads. These are just emergency measures, she explained. For a permanent solution, we need to rebuild properly. Over the next few weeks, I collected the materials Eliza specified, using maintenance requests as cover for my increasingly strange activities. I harvested copper from the original hotel's wiring, still present in parts of the foundation. I retrieved specially carved pieces of oak from an antique store that had once been furniture in the old hotel's lobby. At night, I would take the elevator to the 13th floor, which now responded only to my touch, and work on the reconstruction following Eliza's guidance. The barrier continued to weaken, and twice I had to force back entities that nearly broke through, gelatinous shapes with too many limbs and eyes that burned like dying stars. After each encounter, I would find a new gray streak in my hair, feel new aches in my joints. The work takes its toll, Eliza warned me. This is why the caretaker's lifespan is tied to the building. It gives you strength to do what must be done. I noticed she was becoming more substantial each time I visited, less ghostly and more physical. When I questioned this, she simply said, "As the floor becomes real again, so do I. I am part of it now, as you will be." After 3 months of secret work, the 13th floor began to take solid form. What had started as a ghostly construction site was now an actual floor, with finished walls, proper lighting, and 13 doors leading to 13 apartments that existed in a space that shouldn't be possible. The tear had been reduced to a small, contained point behind a specially designed door at the end of the hallway, a door with 13 locks, each key to a different material. Eliza and I stood in the completed central hallway admiring our work. "It's almost finished," she said, now as solid and real as I was. "Just one final step to bind it all together permanently." She produced a small silver knife from her pocket. "The floor needs a permanent caretaker, someone whose essence is woven into its very structure." She held the knife out to me, handle first. "A willing sacrifice of blood from the caretaker seals the barrier for a generation." I hesitated only briefly before taking the knife. This had become my purpose, my calling. I pressed the blade to my palm and made a clean cut, letting the blood drip onto the central point of the floor's intricate pattern. "With this offering, I accept my role as caretaker." I recited the words Eliza had taught me. "May this barrier stand firm until my final breath." That was 5 years ago. I still work as the maintenance supervisor at Meridian Towers, but my true job is maintaining the barrier on the 13th floor. Residents never notice anything unusual. To them, the elevator simply goes from 12 to 14, as is common in superstitious buildings. Only I can access the 13th floor, using the hidden button that only appears for me. Eliza remains with me, neither fully alive nor dead, but bound to the floor as I am. Sometimes I wonder about the life I left behind, the future I gave up, but then I remember what waits behind that 13 locked door, and I know my sacrifice was necessary. Last month, a new maintenance worker joined the staff, a young woman with sharp eyes and a natural affinity for systems and structures. Yesterday, I noticed her studying the elevator panel with unusual interest, her fingers tracing over the space where the 13th button hides. Soon, I'll need to decide whether to start training her as my eventual replacement or find a way to protect her from this burden. Because the barrier will need a new caretaker someday when my strength fails. The building has already chosen her, I can tell, just as it once chose me. The elevators at Meridian Towers continue their silent operation, carrying residents up and down without incident. But the middle elevator sometimes moves on its own in the early hours, traveling from the lobby to a floor that officially doesn't exist, carrying me to my true purpose, guardian of the threshold, keeper of the 13th floor. I never wanted to move into Riverview Apartments, but as a graduate student with mounting debt and limited options, I couldn't afford to be picky. The rent was suspiciously affordable for a one-bedroom in this part of the city, and the building itself had a certain faded grandeur beneath years of neglect. The real estate agent seemed overly eager to close the deal, glossing over the peeling wallpaper in the lobby and the temperamental plumbing. "The elevator's a bit old," she mentioned as we took it to the 8th floor, "but it's perfectly functional." I noticed how she stared at the doors the entire ride, never once making eye contact or pausing in her practice spiel about amenities. When the elevator made a strange whispering sound, like voices carrying through ventilation, she raised her voice to talk over it. Later, as I signed the lease, I asked about the building's history. "Nothing remarkable," she answered too quickly. "Just your standard pre-war construction, renovated in the 70s. Something in her expression made me wonder what she wasn't telling me, but I needed a place to live, and the university was just a short walk away. I settled into my new apartment and tried to ignore the building's quirks, the pipes that knocked in the walls at night, the flickering lights in the hallway, and the elevator that sometimes smelled of perfume no one wore anymore. It was during my second week there that I first encountered Mrs. Abernathy from apartment 8C, an elderly woman who informed me she'd lived in the building since 1962. "You're in poor Benjamin's old place?" she said, eyeing me with something between suspicion and pity. "Such a tragedy, what happened to him?" Before I could ask what she meant, the elevator arrived and her demeanor changed completely. "I'll take the stairs today," she declared, hurrying toward the exit door despite her cane and apparent arthritis. That night, I researched previous tenants of my apartment and discovered that Benjamin Reeves, a 25-year-old doctoral candidate, had committed suicide 3 months before I moved in. The article mentioned he'd been found in the elevator, though it provided no details on how he'd died. The next morning, I noticed the elevator's inspection certificate was dated exactly 1 day after Benjamin's death. As part of my acoustical engineering program, I had access to high-quality recording equipment, which I decided to set up in my apartment to capture the strange sounds that kept waking me at night. What began as a practical solution to document the noisy pipes for a maintenance request soon evolved into something else entirely. The first night's recordings picked up more than just knocking pipes. There were whispers too faint to make out but distinctly human. The second night, I placed a recorder in the hallway near the elevator. The results were disturbing. Beneath the mechanical hum of the elevator, multiple voices seemed to be having fragmented conversations. One voice, slightly clearer than the others, repeated the same phrase over and over, "Going down. Always going down." I enhanced the audio and isolated this voice, male, young, with a slight tremor suggesting fear or cold. When I played it for my faculty advisor, suggesting it might be interesting from an acoustic phenomenon perspective, she looked deeply troubled. "Where did you record this?" she asked, and when I told her, she insisted I find another apartment immediately. My advisor's reaction unsettled me, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. Instead, I decided to speak with the building manager, Mr. Kelvin, a perpetually tired man who seemed to age a year with each maintenance request. I found him in the basement, tinkering with the ancient boiler. "The elevator's making strange noises," I explained, not mentioning the recordings. "Almost sounds like people talking." Kelvin froze, his wrench suspended mid-turn. "It's just the mechanics," he said without looking at me. "Old systems make odd sounds." When I pressed further, mentioning Benjamin Reeves, he finally turned to face me. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper despite us being alone, "that elevator's been here since the building opened in 1927. They don't make parts for it anymore. I have to custom order everything or fabricate it myself." He wiped his hands nervously on a rag. "Sometimes the shaft acts like a conduit for sounds from other parts of the building. That's all it is." But his eyes told a different story, and as I turned to leave, he called after me, "Maybe take the stairs for a while." I couldn't let it go. Something about the elevator had claimed Benjamin's life, and now it was whispering in the night. The university library had archives of local newspapers dating back to the building's construction, and I spent hours scrolling through microfiche. What I found disturbed me deeply. Riverview Apartments had a history of tragedies centered around its elevator. In 1952, a young mother and her infant had plummeted to their deaths when the cable snapped. In 1978, a maintenance worker was crushed between the car and the shaft wall during repairs. And in 1994, a teenage girl had disappeared after last being seen entering the elevator. Her body was never found. Most disturbing was the earliest incident in 1929, just 2 years after the building opened. 5 people had become trapped in the elevator for 3 days when it stalled between floors during a power outage. By the time help arrived, only 4 were alive. The 5th had apparently taken his own life in desperation. I traced the building's ownership and discovered something odd. After each incident, the building had changed hands, often sold at below-market rates. That evening, Mrs. Abernathy invited me for tea, clearly having noticed my distress. Her apartment was a time capsule of faded elegance, filled with photographs spanning decades. "You've been asking questions," she said, pouring tea from a tarnished silver pot. "About the elevator." I admitted I had, and she nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. "I've lived here longer than anyone," she continued. "Seen them come and go, the owners, the managers, the tenants. And I've seen what happens to people who spend too much time in that elevator." She showed me a photograph from the 1960s. A group of tenants gathered in the lobby for what looked like a holiday party. Everyone in this picture who regularly used the elevator died within 10 years of this photo. Accidents, illnesses, suicides. She pointed to a young man at the edge of the frame. "That was my husband. Heart attack at 42, after complaining for weeks about voices he heard while riding up to our floor. Mrs. Abernathy fixed me with a penetrating gaze. There's something in that shaft that doesn't belong in this world. It feeds on fear, on desperation. And it's patient. Despite warnings from Mrs. Abernathy and the building manager, my scientific curiosity overrode my growing fear. I designed an experiment to capture whatever phenomenon was occurring in the elevator. Late that night, I set up multiple recording devices inside the elevator car, including an infrared camera and an EMF detector borrowed from the physics department. I programmed the elevator to run continuously between floors while I monitored the equipment from my laptop in the lobby. The first hour revealed nothing unusual, but around 2 a.m., the temperature in the car dropped suddenly by 15 degrees. The EMF meter spiked, and the audio recorders picked up what sounded like dozens of voices speaking simultaneously in various languages. Most disturbing was the infrared footage. Indistinct shapes moving around the empty elevator, humanoid but somehow wrong, their proportions stretched and fluid. As I watched, frozen in horrified fascination, one of the shapes seemed to turn toward the camera, although it had no discernible face. Suddenly, all my equipment went dead simultaneously, and the elevator stopped between the 4th and 5th floors. The digital display in the lobby showed a series of numbers that weren't floor designations. 1-9-2-9. I called Mr. Kelvin immediately, who arrived disheveled and clearly unhappy about the late-night summons. "What were you thinking?" he hissed as he manually overrode the elevator controls. "Never run experiments on that thing." The elevator slowly descended to the lobby, its mechanism groaning in protest. When the doors finally opened, my equipment was scattered across the floor, some pieces broken beyond repair. More disturbing was the state of the elevator itself. The walls were covered in condensation, and the floor was wet as if from melted frost despite it being summer. "This is coming out of your security deposit," Kelvin muttered, but I could tell he was more frightened than angry. As he collected the pieces of my equipment, I noticed something written in the condensation on the mirrored back wall. Numbers that matched what had appeared on the display. 1929. "What happened in the elevator in 1929? I asked Kelvin. He straightened up slowly, his face ashen. "Not what happened in the elevator," he corrected. "What happened in the shaft. They found them during renovations in the 70s, skeletal remains walled up at the bottom. Workers from when the building was first constructed." The next day, I knocked on Mrs. Abernathy's door, desperate for more information. She invited me in, looking unsurprised by my visit. "Kelvin told me about your little experiment," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "He's worried you'll end up like the others." Over stronger tea that might have been laced with brandy, she revealed what she knew. The official story is that 3 workers died in accidents during construction, falls from scaffolding, that sort of thing. But the truth is they were murdered. According to Mrs. Abernathy, the building's original owner had been involved in occult practices and believed that sacrifices sealed into the foundation would bring prosperity. The workers discovered something during the excavation, something that should have remained buried. When they threatened to report it, they were silenced and entombed in the elevator shaft. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. But death isn't always the end. Sometimes it's a door left ajar. The most disturbing part of her tale was her certainty that the elevator served as a conduit between worlds. "Those who die in despair can become trapped in such places," she explained. "And others, older things, can use their energy to reach through." I spent the next day in the city archives, searching for confirmation of Mrs. Abernathy's story. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. The original building permits showed numerous violations and suspicious amendments. Death certificates for 5 construction workers listed industrial accident as the cause, though details were conspicuously vague. Most disturbing was a police report I managed to access through a graduate assistant in the criminology department. It detailed the discovery of human remains during the 1970s renovation, including evidence that at least 3 individuals had been walled up alive. The case had been quietly closed, attributed to Prohibition-era gang activity. As I was leaving the archives, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Abernathy, her voice urgent. "Don't come back to the building tonight," she warned. "It's the anniversary." When I asked of what, she replied cryptically, "The first sacrifice. The elevator will be active tonight, more than usual." I thanked her but decided to return anyway, determined to document whatever might occur. This was no longer just about curiosity or academic interest. I needed to understand what had happened to Benjamin and the others before it happened to me. I returned to find Riverview oddly silent, the usual ambient noises of a century-old building conspicuously absent. In the lobby, the elevator doors stood open invitingly, though I hadn't pressed the call button. I set up a single camera in the hallway facing the elevator, then retreated to my apartment to monitor it remotely. At exactly 11:27 p.m., the elevator began moving on its own, stopping at various floors though no one entered or exited. The digital display showed impossible numbers, negative floors that didn't exist. At midnight, the elevator returned to the lobby and remained there with its doors open. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped into frame. A man in outdated clothing, his features blurred in the footage but his movements deliberate as he entered the elevator. I recognized him from photographs in the archives. William Carver, the building's original owner, dead since 1945. More figures followed, each entering the elevator without pressing buttons, their forms translucent and distorted in my camera's feed. I counted 8 in total before the doors finally closed. The display showed the elevator descending below the basement level, to floors that shouldn't exist. And then, through my open window, I heard the screaming start. I knew I should stay in my apartment, but the screams compelled me to act. I took the stairs to the basement, following the sounds to a utility room I'd never noticed before. Inside, an old service door led to a narrow steel staircase descending alongside the elevator shaft. The screams were clearer here, echoing up the shaft, multiple voices in agony or terror. I began my descent, the metal steps cold beneath my fingers as I gripped the railing. The further down I went, the colder it became, my breath visible in the dim emergency lighting. I passed the basement level and kept going, though according to the building plans, nothing should exist below that. After what seemed like an impossible distance, I reached a small platform with a maintenance hatch looking into the shaft. Through a small, grime-covered window, I saw the elevator, stopped at a subterranean level that couldn't possibly exist. Inside, the figures I'd seen earlier were arranged in a circle, their features now clear enough to reveal expressions of ecstatic suffering. In their center stood William Carver, his mouth moving in what appeared to be an incantation. The floor of the elevator had been removed, revealing not a mechanical pit, but a swirling darkness that seemed to consume light itself. I watched in horror as Carver produced an antique knife, its blade glinting despite the absence of proper light. One by one, the specters approached him, extending their wrists over the abyss below. As each phantom wound spilled incorporeal blood into the darkness, the air in the shaft grew heavier, charged with something beyond ordinary physics. The whispers I'd recorded in my apartment were deafening here, thousands of voices crying out in languages both ancient and unknown. Through the window, I could see Carver turning to face me, though it should have been impossible for him to know I was there. His eyes met mine through the grimy glass, and in that moment, I understood what had happened to Benjamin and all the others throughout the decades. They had witnessed this ritual just as I was witnessing it now, and the knowledge had driven them to desperation. The darkness beneath the elevator began to rise, taking form, something with too many limbs and eyes that burned like dying stars. Carver smiled, gesturing for me to join them, and to my horror, I felt my hand reaching for the hatch handle, my body no longer under my control. I fought against the compulsion with everything I had, focusing on Mrs. Abernathy's warnings, on Benjamin's fate, on my own will to survive. The moment of resistance broke whatever influence Carver held over me, and I stumbled backward on the platform. The hatch began to rattle violently, something on the other side trying to force its way through. I turned and fled up the metal staircase, the steps now slick with moisture that hadn't been there during my descent. Behind me, I heard the hatch tear open, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging itself onto the platform. I didn't look back, focusing only on climbing faster, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. The basement door seemed impossibly far away, and the thing below was gaining. I could hear its uneven movements, the scrape of too many appendages on metal, and beneath that, Carver's voice calling my name with intimate familiarity. When I finally reached the door and burst through into the utility room, I slammed it shut and jammed a nearby shelving unit against it. Through the door I heard scratching, then silence. Then, unmistakably, the sound of the elevator mechanism engaging, the car ascending in the shaft. I ran for the lobby, determined to warn anyone I could find. The lobby was deserted when I arrived, but the elevator display showed it returning from whatever impossible depth it had reached. I pulled the fire alarm, hoping to evacuate the building before the doors opened. As alarms blared and confused residents began emerging from their apartments, I saw Mrs. Abernathy watching from the stairwell, her expression grim but unsurprised. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed obscene after what I'd witnessed. The doors slid open to reveal nothing. Just an empty car, immaculately clean with no sign of the horrors I'd seen. But the air that wafted out carried the unmistakable scent of ozone and copper, and for just a moment, I thought I saw William Carver's reflection in the mirrored wall, though I cast no reflection at all. That was 6 months ago. I broke my lease the next day, forsaking my security deposit and moving in with a classmate until I found a new place. Mrs. Abernathy still calls me occasionally, keeping me updated on the building's happenings. 3 more tenants have died since I left. One in a bathtub accident, one from apparent heart failure, and one who threw himself from the roof. All had reported hearing voices in the elevator before their deaths. I've changed my academic focus to architectural history, specifically the occult symbolism in pre-war buildings. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers in my recordings, still feel Carver's eyes on me. The university has an elevator in my department building. I take the stairs no matter how many flights. Because I know now that some shafts don't just go up and down, some go somewhere else entirely.